Full disclosure, I'm Robin Farzad.
Imagine if you're a senior citizen in Florida who hasn't been able to see your grandkids in months because of this virus. Or if you live in Pennsylvania or Michigan or any battleground state, any state in this republic for that matter, and you lost a loved one or you lost a friend or, you're stretching because you have to work from home and your kids are learning from home. The president has not shown a capacity to empathize, to suggest that there might be some sort of national moment of mourning. All the things that we would expect a president of the United States to do to sort of turn this moment of dread and horror into a collective moment of unity, he's done none of it.
The nation is less than 6 weeks away from a major election. More than 200,000 Americans, meanwhile, have died from this pandemic. Washington, D.C. is fixated on another bruising battle over a Supreme Court vacancy. No better time to talk to NBC White House correspondent Geoff Bennett. So do stay with us. This show airs on NPR One, Apple Podcasts, and on Spotify. Find us and rate us, and stay tuned for exciting news on upcoming radio coverage. Joining me from Washington, D.C. is none other than Geoff Bennett, White House correspondent for NBC News. Geoff previously covered the White House for NPR. Before that, he was all over Capitol Hill and national politics for New York One News and the former Time Warner Cable. In a past life, I had the privilege of working with Geoff on NPR's Weekend Edition. And, sir, I'm going to plug it forever that you helped me launch this show. So I am eternally grateful to you. How are you?
It was a proud moment. I'm doing well, Robin. It's great to talk with you again, man.
I know that must be at the very bottom, the footer of your LinkedIn profile.
Hardly.
Down with your
right
summer camp.
At the top. Yeah.
Shucks. I don't even know where to start. You had just attended the pallbearers, the casket, the funeral reception, lying in state of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the Supreme Court justice who just succumbed to pancreatic cancer at the age of 87. And the mood in Washington, D.C. is somewhere between kind of mourning and maybe a fear and loathing of the battle that's ahead. Tell me, give me a temperature check.
Yeah, it was somber, reflective, and I think there's a certain foreboding. Given that I think people know what is to come. And even though Ruth Bader Ginsburg's dying wish, as articulated to her granddaughter, was that the next president nominate her replacement, President Trump, Senate Republicans are pushing forward. And the president, on Saturday afternoon, he says, is going to announce his nominee. And we expect that the Senate Judiciary Committee, is going to hold confirmation hearings in the first half of October. The tentative goal, at least right now, is to hold a confirmation vote on this seat before the election. There are a number of reasons for that, not the least of which is that Republicans aren't entirely sure if President Trump's going to win re-election. And of course, this entire thing gets more fraught if Joe Biden wins and the White House and Senate Republicans are pushing through a Supreme Court nominee in a lame duck session.
Contrary to popular belief, there isn't all that much formal instruction about the Supreme Court in the Constitution, or going back to the time of our founding fathers. I understand that it's fluctuated anywhere from 5 justices to 10. Just after the Civil War, it settled back at 9. FDR failed to, clear what he called reactionary justices out in the wake of his New Deal reforms impacting the court, and it has stood since at 9 justices.
Yeah, for the last 150 years or so. And even though, some blue checks on Twitter, as we so often say, and progressive activists have suggested that if Republicans move forward, then Democrats should pack the court and turn it into a court of 11 or 16, 17, pick your number. Joe Biden and Senate Democrats, at least for right now, seem to be pushing back on that. I think the calculation, certainly for Joe Biden, is that that's not something that he wants to campaign on. It's not something he wants to be asked about. It's not a door that he wants to be able to give this president to further suggest that Joe Biden is somehow a Trojan horse and that, if he's elected, he's going to do the bidding of the quote unquote radical left. So right now, what Democrats are trying to do is that they're trying to make clear to the American people what a right-leaning Supreme Court would mean for a generation to come, because that's what's going to happen if or when President Trump gets his nominee confirmed. And so what that means is the Affordable Care Act gets gutted. It could potentially mean that Roe v. Wade is overturned. It means that if the court sees cases related to gun rights or climate change or affirmative action or marriage equality or just name your list of things that progressives care about, then a lot of those rights that people have taken for granted, a lot of the policies that people just assume exist because they've always existed, could be undone. And so I think that's the challenge that Democrats have right now, is that there's always been this asymmetry where Republicans care more about the court than Democrats do. Now Democrats are trying to make clear to people that this is something that people who align themselves with progressives and with liberal causes really need to care about and focus on and vote on come November.
What do you think if the White House, as expected, gets its nominee and the Senate does run it through either before or after the election, that this is clearly being done against the will of around, 50 Democrats or just under? There were a couple of Republicans that stepped forward, Susan Collins, Senator Murkowski of Alaska, who said that we wouldn't support it. But even after that, they do have the numbers, including Vice President Pence, to push it through. Who do you think gets in pure, let's say, reductionist terms, who gets the bigger wave out of it? Is there a bigger blue wave that comes out of that anger, or a red wave that comes out of that vindication that Trump delivered, a generational majority for conservatives?
I think Democrats stand to benefit here. And here's why. The president has not been able to, and frankly has never shown a willingness to reach out, to speak to represent more than his base. And so even when it comes to the courts, I'm not entirely sure that this seat is something that he's going to be able to convince a wide swath of voters that they need to vote for him on, beyond, his handling of the coronavirus pandemic, where 200,000 Americans have died effectively on his watch, his statements about civil unrest, just his overall demeanor and deportment. And frankly, polling has shown, and this is just in, the last couple of days or so, that, if you frame it as, do you care about balance on the court, then Americans by and large do think it's appropriate that the next president should get to pick the replacement for Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And so a lot of this, I think, will come down to the ways in which Democrats talk about this, the way it's messaged, and to not allow President Trump to frame this entire debate. Because he does have that effect. I mean, one, he's president, so he gets sort of an outsized influence in that regard. Everyone just kind of focuses on everything a president says and does. But because of sort of his bellicose style and this sort of like torrent of disinformation and mistruths and lies and all of that, he has a way of owning the narrative. And it's really hard for Joe Biden, for anyone really, to sort of break through all that.
Why is it so taboo? And you quoted an NBC News piece on Senate Democrats downplaying the talk of drastic changes for the Supreme Court. All of this stuff about warning and telegraphing people, and Senator Warren out there and Biden's deputies and Confederates out there saying, you understand the severity of this. But then what? Okay, suppose, let's take the thought experiment. The Senate shifts Democrat. Biden wins by a decent majority. The House is kept. Maybe the majority there is grown by Democrats. They can go into February saying we now have a mandate. And yet you have a president who left maybe in popularity, who had appointed a third of the justices to the Supreme Court. So why is it so taboo for them to say, actually, we should be able to appoint justices, not just because of what happened in the final 50 days of the Trump presidency, but going back to the original sin with what happened with Obama and Merrick Garland and Senator Mitch McConnell thwarting that in the final year of Obama's presidency?
Yeah, it's a great point. Democrats could make the case that there were 2 stolen seats, and so that they make up for it with 2 more seats that they add to the court, or 3 more seats that they add to the court. I mean, I think that at the core of your question is sort of this persistent question, which is, why won't Democrats get tough? I mean, Republicans have shown that they care in many ways less about governing and more about ruling. And Democrats generally, because they tend to be more intellectually honest and do care about governing, haven't been able to go beyond sort of the empty threats. I mean, Nancy Pelosi said that, she might impeach the president again to kind of gum up the works of the Senate so that it wouldn't be so easy to confirm a nominee. They also said at one point that they might withhold the votes on government funding. Well, just yesterday, they voted on a government funding measure, right? So time and time again, what you see are Democrats issue these threats and say what they're going to do and how, this is the end of the world and the whole thing, but yet it never seems to be backed up by action. So if Joe Biden does win the presidency and he has at his left flank people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ilhan Omar and Ayanna Pressley and just, the sort of the super progressive wing of the party, who are urging him to do these kind of things and to get tough. I think that could be really, really influential because Joe Biden naturally is not that kind of guy. I mean, when his term was over, if you go back and check C-SPAN, you can watch the really sort of poignant words between him and Mitch McConnell talking about how they were friends. And McConnell talks about how, he and Joe Biden were on opposite ends of the aisle. But, McConnell says, I could always trust your word. And the relationship that Lindsey Graham and Joe Biden had, I think, is pretty well known, apart from the fact that Lindsey Graham said all sorts of horrible things about Hunter Biden during the impeachment. But Joe Biden's sort of natural inclination is to want to find ways to compromise and work together, even as Republicans obstructed him and obstructed President Obama at every turn.
We're talking to Geoff Bennett, White House correspondent at NBC News. I have checked Real Clear Politics, and the polling average has Biden ahead by about 7 points with, 6 weeks left until November 3rd?
Yeah.
What is the disproportionate attention being given now to states that, it's very fascinating to go back and look at the states that Obama won when the nation was in a financial crisis in 2008, that you didn't expect these states to go easily to a Democratic newcomer and everything. And he pretty resoundingly won against John McCain in 2008. And there are many Democrats out there that are romancing this possibility, not just North Carolina and Georgia, but maybe we take the ruby red likes of Texas.
Yeah, maybe. Beto O'Rourke did fairly well against Ted Cruz, even though he lost. And so the Turn Texas Blue effort is something that I think Democrats have been talking about since, I don't know, at least I've been covering it at least since 2006, 2008. But this could potentially, who knows, be the year that it happens. One of the things that we're paying close attention to is the states where Biden is doing well and could potentially win, if not for some sort of hinky thing happening with the ballots. And so, like, for instance, in Pennsylvania, there's this issue with naked ballots, which could be the new hanging Chad. Everybody remembers the hanging Chads from Florida in 2000. And the issue there is that Florida is now requiring that if you mail your ballot in, if you vote absentee, if you get a mail-in ballot, you have to put your ballot in a so-called secrecy envelope. It's the thing you put your ballot in, you sign it, and the secrecy envelope or privacy envelope is designed to preserve anonymity and prevent tampering. You then put that secrecy envelope into a postmark envelope, and then you send it back. But, when people get their mail-in ballots, first of all, you've got two envelopes, you've got all these mailers, all these sort of fill-in papers. Usually it's in two languages. It's hard to make sense of. People don't read it very carefully, and they just sign the ballot, put it back in the envelope, and mail it back. Well, that is called a naked ballot, and those ballots, Supreme Court in Pennsylvania now says, can be thrown out. And there is an election official in Philadelphia, a Democrat, who estimates that 100,000 people, 100,000 voters could be disenfranchised because of this naked ballot issue in Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania is a state that Donald Trump won by 44,000 votes in 2016. So you can imagine how this is a huge issue. And then in Florida, there's all sorts of issues with disinformation, Spanish language disinformation, QAnon, all the people who sort of hang out in the dark recesses of Facebook. And so that's an issue, too, where Joe Biden would like to be doing better with Hispanic voters, Latino voters. But then there's this sort of unknown factor of disinformation, misinformation, that is really hard to campaign against if you can't fully get your arms around it.
Do you suspect that there is going to be a result by midnight or worst case scenario by the following sunrise? Or is this going to linger out kind of 2000 style?
Yeah, I think we at NBC are trying to educate our viewers that election night could be election week. And so will we know at 11 o'clock on the night of November 3rd? Probably not. I mean, of course, the huge caveat here is that if there is a huge turnout and Joe Biden's victory is resounding, then sure. But given the pandemic and you have all of these people voting by mail, it takes time to count those ballots. Some states allow the ballots to be counted if they're received after Election Day, so long as they're postmarked on Election Day. So you have to account for that. And I think the real danger here, and it's only a danger because Donald Trump has made it so, is that if it looks as if Donald Trump is winning the night of November 3rd, and then, 2 days later, when all the votes are counted, Joe Biden emerges as the victor, the Trump campaign is going to launch all sorts of legal challenges and court action no matter what. But if that happens, and if the margin is slim, and if there are issues like with these naked ballots or with the voting access, then we could be in for a real nightmare where, this gets contested, it's brutal, it's partisan, and then it goes potentially to the Supreme Court that the president has just, named a justice to, that has this sort of artificial, I say artificial because as Democrats see it, 2 seats were stolen, but an artificial conservative tilt to it that then hands Donald Trump the presidency, much like we saw with Bush v. Gore in 2000.
Geoff, after a special election in 2017, DNC Chairman Tom Perez tweeted, let me be clear. We won in Alabama and Virginia because black women led us to victory. Black women are the backbone of the Democratic Party, and we can't take that for granted, period. Yes, it was a special situation. Yes, the GOP nominee for that seat to take over Jeff Sessions' longtime Senate seat was a flawed candidate, and Doug Jones, very, very bizarre for a Democrat, with the full backing of the party to win that seat. But it did put in sharp relief when you do get black turnout, especially in the Deep South, how powerful it could be.
Yeah, that's right. And across the board, when more people vote, Democrats do better. And that's one of the reasons why Donald Trump, eons ago, I guess it was months ago, it feels like eons, said in an interview with some conservative outlet, probably Fox News, he said, if we have mail-in voting at high levels, you'll never have a Republican elected in this country ever again. And so, yes, Tom Perez was correct. Black women are the backbone of the Democratic Party, and that has been the case cycle after cycle. One of the ways the Trump campaign is trying to cut in to the Democrats standing among black voters is by focusing on black men. In the 2016 race, black men, some of them broke for Donald Trump in ways that both the Clinton campaign and Trump campaign did not expect. A lot of that had to do with the fact, with the ways in which people viewed Hillary Clinton. It also had to do with Donald Trump's approach when he used this phrase, what do you have to lose? That struck a lot of people as offensive and racist. But it also, I think, resonated with some people who said, okay, he might have a point. Democrats have taken the black vote for granted. And so there were a number of mostly black men who broke for Donald Trump in ways that were helpful to him. And I think this time around, Joe Biden and Democrats have their work cut out for them in trying to win back those voters, those black voters who broke for Donald Trump. Is it enough to put Kamala Harris as his VP? No, of course not. He has to articulate policies and has to articulate a vision that appeals to that demographic in much the same way he would have to do for any other group.
But on the furor on Breonna Taylor, which is very much in the news today, and George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, is that going to translate, do you think, into kind of a sense of defeatism, or what's the point? Or is it going to energize people on balance to go to the polls?
I think overall it'll be energizing. And part of the reason why it'll be energizing is because of the way President Trump messages and talks about these issues. He views law enforcement as one of his natural constituencies, right? So he's always going to side with them. But even, calling protesters thugs, siding with those who want Confederate statues to stand, the sort of weird stops and starts at police reform, and the president has given up on that entirely. But what he does is he pivots and talks about criminal justice reform. Well, police reform and criminal justice reform are two very different things. And then also the way he talks about, in Joe Biden's America, you're going to have all of these thugs and protesters and Antifa coming into your suburbs and bothering, you perfect, virginal American suburban housewives, as the president puts it. So, to the degree that is off-putting, and to the degree that I think pushes people to the polls, I think, the president hasn't fully thought through sort of the unintended consequences of talking about the civil unrest and the push for social justice that we've seen since the police killing of George Floyd.
We're because of what happened, the bombshell with Ruth Bader Ginsburg, it's conveniently, I think, downplaying the other 50-ton elephant in the room, which is COVID, this unprecedented pandemic and economic crisis this year. You had unemployment shoot up to the mid-teens for much of the spring and the summer. You had 200,000 people dead. You have parents livid that their kids aren't able to attend school. They're not able to see their parents in assisted living facilities. You would think that that would translate into a more reflexive kind of give no chance to this president to get reelected. But even then, he has really high numbers, especially among the GOP base.
Yeah, you would think, right? Especially after we learned from the Bob Woodward book that the president for months had intentionally misled, deliberately deceived the American people about the severity and the danger of this crisis. And yet, the people's views about Donald Trump are mostly baked in. If you love him, you love him. If you hate him, you hate him. And just this week, the president was campaigning, and he has said nothing substantial about the sort of the really just grave milestone, 200,000 Americans dead from this virus. Instead, what he said was, nobody gets it. He talked about how children under 18 are almost immune. He's going back really and talking about this virus in the way that he talked about it back in January. And so imagine if you're a senior citizen in Florida who hasn't been able to see your grandkids in months because of this virus. Or, if you live in Pennsylvania or Michigan or any battleground state, any state in this republic for that matter, and you lost a loved one or you lost a friend, or you're stretching because you have to work from home and your kids are learning from home. The president has not shown a capacity to empathize, to suggest that there might be some sort of national moment of mourning, all the things that we would expect a president of the United States to do, to sort of turn this moment of dread and horror into a collective moment of unity. He's done none of it. And frankly, he's gone back to talking about it the way he talked about it at the beginning, to suggest that this is some sort of hoax that Democrats are making too much of to hurt him politically. He personalizes everything, and he's personalized this virus. And because it hurts him politically, he's downplayed it to the point of suggesting that, as he put it, nobody has died. Nobody gets it. It hurts almost nobody, which is just a really a deeply offensive way to talk about a virus that has killed 200,000 people at least.
We are on the brink of having the first debate between these two candidates take place Tuesday, September 29th at Case Western University and the Cleveland Clinic in Cleveland, Ohio. Very important swing state of Ohio. Moderator Chris Wallace of Fox News selects these topics, and I'm reading them on the Fox News website. The Trump and Biden records, the Supreme Court, COVID-19, the economy, the integrity of the election, and this really bulged out at me when I saw it phrased as such: race and violence in our cities. It seems to be kind of more than suggestive that race and violence are inextricably linked.
Right. Yeah. And he's using, Chris Wallace, of course, works at Fox News. He's using the Fox News framing, which is, of course, not at all. It fails to capture the underlying issue. I mean, there's violence in some cities, and there has been violent interactions between police and protesters because of the excessive use of force by police against mostly black men, but also black women, people of color writ large. And this is a president who time and time again says there is no systemic racism in policing, I think in part because he doesn't fully understand it. I think systemic racism doesn't suggest that every police officer is actively racist. All it means is that they work within a system that is inherently racist. And it's not even an issue of whether or not the president believes it. It is a thing that is so. And we know that just based on the sheer numbers, on the data. And so, it'll be interesting to see how Chris Wallace frames those questions and the degree to which Joe Biden is on it, frankly, and can disabuse people of these false notions. And try to bring the conversation back to terms that I think fully reflect the lived experience of so many people in this country, and that it's not this sort of issue of violence happening in cities disconnected from the sort of larger pernicious issue of police use of force.
Full disclosure, I'm Robin Farzad. You are listening to Geoff Bennett. He is White House correspondent for NBC News. Geoff, also, do you still occasionally guest host C-SPAN's Washington Journal?
No, I haven't done that in years, but I miss it. Just getting to talk to any and everybody on a Saturday morning calling in about issues of the day, but I haven't done that in I don't know 3 or 4 years.
Well, it's always inspiring when I'm in there and I have, Capitol Hill in the background, and it's such a incredible vista early on a Saturday morning or a Sunday morning. And it does have me wondering about statehood for D.C., especially if the Democrats take the Senate, the Democrats take the White House. Is this less of an exotic prospect than it used to be? And by extension, what about Puerto Rico?
Yeah, well, here's the thing. I'm interested to see the degree to which Democrats actually, if they win, if Joe Biden wins and if Democrats take the Senate, the degree to which Democrats actually do the thing that has been on their blue sky list for decades, and that's statehood for D.C., statehood for Puerto Rico, because you do have this issue where the Senate is uneven. We're almost minority, well, not almost, we are minority rule, where people are concentrated in states like New York and California, in other places on the coasts, and yet in the more sparsely populated center of the country, they do have a sort of a disproportionate impact and pull in our politics. And of course, granting statehood to D.C. and to Puerto Rico is one way to get around that and to make up for it. But it's also true that no American should be living anywhere where they don't have full representation. And so that's also a separate issue that I think Democrats care a lot about, which is, if you are an American citizen and you pay taxes, your voice should be represented in Congress fully.
Well, you saw Puerto Rico getting walloped by that hurricane a couple of years ago, and that much of the country did feel disenfranchised, even though there are, you are citizens, you are a territory of the United States. You didn't quite feel first-class citizenship there, and I wonder if that changed the debate, which has raged on there for 40, 50 years on whether statehood.
Yeah, that's right. And the only reason why the president came around to suggesting that they get that billions of dollars of relief aid that they needed is because he needs the votes of Puerto Ricans in Florida, right? It had really nothing to do with the Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico. And the president had resisted giving them that additional aid for years, suggesting that, it was mismanaged because it's Democrat leaning and the whole thing. And so, yes, I think that's one way around it. You give, if you're in American territory, if you're in American district, what have you, you deserve full representation and you deserve a vote so that when, God forbid, there are natural disasters or anything for that matter, and you need representation, you need influence, you have it. And it's not an issue of the value that you may or may not bring in an election year.
You saw the optics of children in cages and the wall terminology and, Salvadorian or Central American migrants being conflated, almost synonymized with gangs and thugs and rapists and everything coming in. And yet you look at the Latinx population in the United States, and it's by no means monolithic. Trump is indeed very popular among certain Cuban exiles in South Florida. I'm amazed, having covered them, in my book, that there are people who were discriminated against when they came in on the Mariel boat lift or when they came in the 60s or 70s, who then tend to become more reactionary over the decades, saying that, no, we are now Americans and you should, in fact, deport other Cuban exiles who are here. You should, in fact, deport Mexicans or Guatemalans who came here illegally, even as some of these people came here on boat lifts or semi-legally.
Yeah, it's a great point. I think the sort of different political and cultural identities within the Latin diaspora. And to bring it back to something that we talked about at the outset, the Supreme Court. One of the people the president is considering for his Supreme Court pick is Judge Barbara Lagoa, who is the daughter of Cuban immigrants. She herself is Cuban American, has deep roots in the Miami Cuban community. And President Trump, saying the quiet part out loud on Fox News earlier this week, said of her, "I don't know her. I hear she's terrific. She's Hispanic and she's from Florida. I love Florida." And so, if he settles on her, I think it's certainly an election year play. But yeah, I mean, you cannot sort of apply the broad brushstroke, frankly, to any ethnic or racial group, but certainly not to American Latinos who are, being Puerto Rican is not the same as being Mexican, is not the same as being from El Salvador, is not the same as being from Cuba. And certainly in Florida politics, I think that's most pronounced with Florida's Cuban American community.
How does that play out in Texas, though? You have Democratic strategists for the longest time saying that this is bound to turn over. I mean, after all, Virginia used to be a dark red state. Clinton didn't used to win Virginia, and now it's decidedly purple. You don't hear many people talking about it as a likely swing state this time around. As kind of N tends toward infinity, aren't you going to see Texas resemble Northern Virginia and California more, especially with the changing population, or you look at North Carolina and the Research Triangle and the influx of people moving from blue states.
Yeah, right. That's true. Especially as California, unfortunately, becomes more uninhabitable, whether it's because of the fires or because of rising housing prices, and it just becomes you can't afford to live there anymore. People are moving more to Austin and different parts of Texas. But it's also true that Texas's Latino community tends to be younger. So the degree to which Biden and Democrats more broadly can appeal to younger voters across the board, I think will be beneficial to them in helping, make an appeal to Latino Texas voters. Again, the president, both President Trump and Joe Biden, I think, cannot take that voting bloc for granted.
Can you remember a president or presidential candidate in recent history, especially, who was so unwelcome in his home city and home state as Donald Trump? I mean, I think for all intents and purposes, as much as this guy was, he was synonymous with New York and kind of the limousine garish developer and everything else that he did in the stunts in the 80s and the 90s and the cameos. He is probably the first Florida man president and presidential candidate, because he's really not welcome in New York City anymore.
Yeah, that's true. And, I'm thinking of the stunt that New York Mayor Bill de Blasio pulled, where he painted Black Lives Matter in
outside the Trump Tower,
huge letters, in yellow paint outside Trump Tower. And the reason I use the word stunt is because that's what it was. I mean, I think he sort of co-opted the Black Lives Matter movement to make a point about President Trump. But the president hasn't really been back to that Fifth Avenue penthouse apartment very much. Part of it is because when he is there, they effectively have to shut down the street. I mean, they bring out the dump trucks and they block off that part of Fifth Avenue. Secret Service does for obvious security reasons. But it's also true that he's not really welcome there. The president has, he changed his home residence to Florida. He votes by mail, even though he keeps suggesting falsely that there's some, fraud involved. But he's twice voted by mail. And when he leaves the presidency, he'll probably move to Florida. I would imagine that his presidential library, whenever it's built, I'm sure there'll be one in Queens since that's where he was born. But I imagine if he had his druthers, it would be in Florida. This is a president who goes where he is wanted. I mean, he golfs at his own properties. He eats at his own hotels. He does not really interact with people who don't like him. And because he's sort of persona non grata among New Yorkers, he doesn't really go back to or interact very much with folks back home, his New York home.
Tell me what it's been like. I know it's been a dream of yours to become a TV correspondent, and you put in your dues since you transitioned away from radio a decade ago, covering Capitol Hill at New York One, going to NPR to cover the Beltway and the White House, and now to be at a White House where there's an openly, oftentimes antagonistic relationship with what he calls the mainstream press. I mean, we saw this past week at a rally, he was kind of laughing, making light of the fact that MSNBC's Ali Velshi was hit by a rubber bullet. I mean, these are certain things that were completely taboo just before his presidency.
Yeah, they were, and they should be. I'll say this about President Trump: so much of that stuff is performative. He calls us fake news, and yet he talks to us off the record. He invites reporters into the Oval Office for chats. He doesn't do this so much anymore, but in the early days of his presidency, he would call reporters directly, including like Maggie Haberman. And give off the record guidance this is a president who talks to reporters on the record too. I mean, he makes himself available all the time, in part because he knows the value of speaking to the press. And yet he calls us fake because he doesn't like our reporting. He doesn't like that we hold him to account. And so again, this is a president who personalizes everything. He sees the presidency as an extension of himself. He sees every federal agency as an extension of himself. One of the reasons why he attacks Jeff Bezos of the Washington Post is because he doesn't understand that just because Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post, that he then doesn't direct the coverage of the Washington Post. President Trump sees it all as one and the same. And certainly, if Donald Trump ever bought a TV station or a newspaper, you can bet that the views reflected by that institution would be those of Donald Trump. And so that, I think, is what has made everything about this presidency so different. In the early days, there were people who at least tried to provide some semblance of guardrails. Those people are mostly gone. And so what you see now are people working for this president who, for the most part, align themselves with the let Trump be Trump approach. And that's what he's doing. If he is granted another 4 years in office, I would imagine that a lot of those people would stick around, in part because the universe of people who want to work at this White House, can work at this White House, and would be vetted, I think is relatively slim. And so, this is a president who was impeached for abuse of power and continues, his critics say, to continue to do the same things that he was impeached for, and use language and rhetoric that is way more divisive than even the sort of partisan bellicose rhetoric of 2016. So this is a slowly encroaching. He keeps busting norms and then moving past that line. And so, I can't imagine what the next 40 days will bring, but we're all sort of buckled up for it.
Jeff, everything seems in the year 2020 has to get in line behind COVID and this upcoming battle over the Supreme Court and the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. But let's not forget that also in the wake of impeachment, he took out the military leader of Iran. And many people started this year thinking that it was going to be the incipients of a World War III with the Middle East. In fact, It's ending very differently. You didn't see much of a reaction from Iran, and Trump has been out there for most of September hailing these deals between, say, the UAE and Bahrain and Israel. And is that an indicator for what might be expected in the future with Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia and a grand bargain with Israel? What are you hearing, or to what extent can they leverage that for electoral gains?
Well, I think they're certainly trying to do that with the evangelical community. Every chance the president gets, he talks about how they moved the embassy to Jerusalem and all of that. And to the degree that people thought there'd be World War III between the U.S. and Iran, people thought that too with the U.S. and North Korea. And then the president began his so-called love affair with Kim Jong-un and the summits and all of that. The foreign policy it's harder for me anyway to get a read on it because the president sort of engages and disengages sort of at will, and so you don't know that these plans and these peace accords are coming until they actually just sort of pop up, and he credits his son-in-law Jared Kushner with doing all the hard work and heavy lifting. Of course, that's not the entire story. But I will say the one thing that he has been consistent on is saying that he wants to bring an end to sort of, U.S. involvement in overseas conflict. And so, drawing down troops from Afghanistan, drawing down troops from Iraq. I'm sure there are a host of unintended consequences related to both decisions, of which I'm not, fully aware. But the Trump doctrine, such that it exists in terms of foreign policy, is sort of reducing America's footprint abroad and letting other folks work out their stuff, for lack of a better phrase. And so I would hope that we would see more of that in the Trump and Biden administration, because that's certainly where the sort of the American view stands, to do sort of less less foreign interference among U.S. interests.
Geoff, in the 10 minutes or so we have left with you, I'd love for you to look into your crystal ball. And one thing that comes to mind here is I'm still haunted by what was called, in the wake of Mitt Romney losing the 2012 election, the GOP autopsy, where Republican elders, I'm quoting Politico, drew up a blueprint for a kinder, more inclusive Republican Party. Donald Trump over Twitter tore that apart, and then just 3-4 years later, he was the candidate of the party. Suppose he does lose, whether he loses bigly or marginally, or if it's contested or drawn out. Does this have to, this kind of reconciliation have to happen? This idea that you can't ignore the obvious, that demographics are against you, that you need to have a better message towards immigrants and a more expansive tent, that maybe that this was just an aberration, that Trump was elected in 2016 and he in fact is not going to be the future of the party after this loss.
Yeah, or that, Republicans decide that they have to field better candidates. Republicans got a Donald Trump because they started with a Sarah Palin, right? And so what you've seen is this sort of push away from intellectualism toward cults of personality and people wanting to be entertained. And so, if Republicans are able, if there's any sort of autopsy, if Donald Trump loses, if there's any sort of autopsy to be done, it's, how did Republicans end up in 2016 having so many candidates, most of whom weren't serious candidates, like a Ben Carson and a Herman Cain and a Donald Trump, and Carly Fiorina, although I'm sure she, considered herself to be a serious candidate, and sort of a middle of the road guy like Jeb Bush. Didn't stand a shot. Marco Rubio didn't have a shot. Ted Cruz, for whatever people think about him personally, didn't have a chance. And so I think there has to be a lot of, for Republicans, if Donald Trump loses, a lot of heavy lifting and hard thinking about that. If he wins, then, ultimately, whatever lesson learned, whatever lesson people need to learn is sort of thrown out the window by a win. And then the other side of it will be what Democrats have to figure out, how it was that they didn't get, how they ended up not nominating a Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren or a Kamala Harris at the top of the ticket, for that matter, or any number of candidates who were, eminently qualified and also sort of, captured the zeitgeist, but for whatever reason weren't able to win the nomination. And so there's so much to be learned, I think, from what's going to happen 40 days from now. But if Donald Trump loses and Republicans lose the Senate, one of the things I'll be watching for is, do we see a resurgence of the Mitt Romney, Jeff Flake sort of moderate wing, whatever of it is left, the Lincoln Project, Never Trumper wing of the Republican Party? Are they like a phoenix that rises from the ashes?
Who are the torchbearers for that in elected office right now? It's very possible that Susan Collins in Maine loses her seat. There's a lot of money that's sluiced into that race since the RBG passing. I can't quite name who, except on the sidelines, you might have a Bill, who was Vice President Quayle's chief of staff. Some people who write columns and
like Bill Kristol, yeah.
Bill Kristol or Mr. Frum in the Atlantic. I sense that many of these people are in the sidelines. They're not in the mix. Maybe a Mitt Romney, but he's already been tried as a presidential candidate.
Yeah. It's a great question. I'm not entirely sure. I'd probably have to look to the House, right, to look at some up and comers. But yeah, I think there are any number of people who, like a chameleon, would probably change their stripes if Donald Trump lost, to suggest that they supported him because he was a Republican president, and it's important to support the standard bearer of your party. But now they're just, going to try to go along to get along. I could totally see that happening, because, frankly, we've seen that already, where people tend to have sort of, situational ethics and try to have situational precedent for things to sort of, so that they always come out on the right side.
From one reporter to another reporter, sir, what are we short shrifting? What do you see kind of with your gimlet eye, everything that's out there that should be covered more? At night, you tell your family and your friends that, gosh, I wish this would get more coverage on my beat or around my beat.
I think one of the things that we sort of take for granted, and I say we as reporters and political reporters in particular, is that everyone is focused on this race to the degree that we are. And I think with the pandemic, with so many people out of work, with people concerned about, their aging parents who might be isolated and lonely, people who are concerned about their kids who are also isolated and lonely, who they also have to, teach at home while they're also trying to hold down a job. People are not connected to this race in the ways that we think they are. A lot of people don't even know when Election Day is. And so that's the thing that I think that we kind of have to remind ourselves about, is that we have to talk about the race and talk about the issues that matter, and we can't shorthand it because a lot of people aren't engaged because they frankly don't have the time to be. Even if they wanted to be, they just don't have the time. And so that's one of the things I'm focused on. I'm also focused on sort of the sort of lasting impact of this now 6-month quarantine, with the job loss, with the sort of just emotional trauma and damage sustained from all of this, how it's going to affect our culture, how it will affect the next president, if it has to be a Joe Biden. He talks so much about a healing for this country, what that looks like. Will we ever fully honor the 200,000 lives that have been lost? I'm focused on that as well. And so, those are some of the things that I'm sort of keeping an eye on as we do all this reporting day in and day out.
Geoff, I got to ask you, are there any contenders for what DC's name is going to be changed to? Clearly, Washington's football team is still a work in progress, but I heard everything from kind of Veto State to Gridlockistan. Do you guys discuss what the names might be? Because certainly it can't be Washington State. It would be redundant.
Yeah, that's true. I haven't thought about that. I mean, right now we're so focused on naming Washington's football team. Is it going to be the Washington Warriors or the Washington Red Tails or whatever? I hadn't even thought about what the District of Columbia would be if they got statehood.
Geoff Bennett, Tri-State Colossus. Not only do you see him in Virginia, but you see him in Delaware, in North Carolina. Completely internationally known White House correspondent for NBC News. Sir, needless to say, you are always welcome on this show that you... Once again, you this monstrosity that you helped create.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
That's great talking to you, Robin, always.
Thank you, Geoff. Full disclosure, special thanks to our engineer, John Valentine. This show airs on NPR One, on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Find us and rate us gloriously, I hope. And stay tuned for exciting news on upcoming radio coverage. Hi, Mom. I love you. I'm Robin Farzad, back with you next week.